Hi everyone. I wanted to say thanks for coming out to this panel and this presentation. I'm not able to be in Vancouver right now. Actually, weirdly, I was there just a couple of weeks ago and I couldn't do two trips together with some family obligations. So I was able to make a video presentation of my talk today, which is called Risk Selfies and Environmental Risk Literacy, and I hope you enjoy it. This project started when I first moved to Corvallis, and I took a position at Oregon State University. And I was kind of heartened by the fact that the city had recently been named by the New York Times as the safest place to live in the U.S. for risk of natural disaster. And so was my mother, by the way. Moving from Indiana, I was looking forward to summer nights without the interruption of tornado sirens and the actual threat of tornadoes. Soon after I arrived, however, it became widely reported that the Pacific Northwest was actually at risk for a massive Pacific floor earthquake. What is now often called the full rip earthquake, or the really big one, to quote the line from Catherine Schultz's 2015 New Yorker article, is an earthquake predicted to occur along the Juan de Fuca Fault in the Cascadia subduction zone, roughly 9.0 in magnitude. The earthquake event could also instigate a significant tsunami wave, causing havoc along the northwest coast. And for me, these two depictions of risk were startling in their distinction, and the discrepancy prompted me to consider how risk was being locally articulated, especially when the threat of an earthquake operating on a roughly 300-year cycle is so difficult to communicate to a population that is less accustomed to dealing with distant, occluded threats. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on one geologic instance and the articulation of risk associated with that geology. And more specifically, I'm going to focus on how risk was represented, not in the infographics of the New York Times or the long-form journalism of the New Yorker, but in how a participant engagement in earthquake preparation was fostered by a somewhat successful social media risk campaign. So this campaign, one that I'll refer to from here on out as the 14 gallons hashtag, has ended pretty much. But it tried something unique in the realm of rhetoric and risk. So specifically, the hashtag tried to generate risk assessment and literacy by bringing together associations of humans and non-humans through social media, though primarily through Twitter. The various actors involved in this articulation of risk, though not particularly successful, is nonetheless worth further attention. Because it has some interesting lessons. So I'll explain a bit more about the context of this 14 gallons hashtag campaign, explain some Twitter details on the hashtag itself, locate the campaign within a broader scholarship of rhetoric and risk, and then try to follow the hashtag how it generated risk, borrowing some concepts from Laurie Grease's iconographic tracking methodology. So the full rip earthquake is a predicted earthquake along the Juan de Fuca Fault in the Cascadia subduction zone, roughly expected to be about 9.0 in magnitude, possibly also instigating a significant tsunami wave, all predicted to happen within the coming 100 years or so. And the way the subduction zone works is that there's two faults or two plates that are coming together. One puts a lot of pressure on the other until it pops. Geologic and dendrochronologic research, and that's tree ring research, evidence suggests that a significant seismic activity occurred from the Juan de Fuca Fault on January 26th in 1700. A tsunami was recorded on the Iwate prefecture of Japan, and red cedar ghost forests were generated in Oregon and Washington. Native American oral legends from the Makah and Quinault nations and the Hui-Hayat First Nation, among others, also indicate that an earthquake and tsunami occurred around the same time. Much of the definition of the full rip earthquake rests on the perception of and evidence for risk of the event, though risk is a pretty elusive conception built from both symbolically constructed and materially present forces. Risk can be defined through likelihood, and the predictions for the earthquake and tsunami vary. Schultz cites a 30% chance of an 8.0 to 8.6 Cascadia earthquake and a 10% chance of an 8.7 to 9.2 in the next 50 years. Other newer estimates suggest that the chance of a significant event off Central Oregon and Central and Oregon coast is about 15 to 20% in the next 50 years. Chris Goldfinger, who's a geologist at Oregon State University, states that the average recurrence interval for a big Juan de Fuca earthquake is 243 years, which is a bit worrisome when you realize the last earthquake was in 1700, and then you do a little bit of math. But that said, the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries' Ian Madden has explained, quote, "You're not overdue for an earthquake until you're 3 standard deviations beyond the mean," which in the case of the full margin Cascadia earthquake means about 800 years from now. But risk can also be described by the estimated damage that could occur. FEMA projects that nearly 13,000 people will die in a Cascadia earthquake and tsunami. 27,000 will be injured, 500,000 will be displaced, and food and fresh water will have to be provided for another 2.5 million. And here lies the exigence for the 14 Gallons campaign. Created by Oregon Public Broadcasting, or OPB, on October 12, 2015, OPB articulates the goals of the campaign thusly. Quote, "We've learned through our reporting that most people think preparedness is canned food, not gallons of water. But here's the catch. The average human can survive nearly 3 weeks without food, but only 72 hours without water. And here's how you can participate. Step 1, obtain 14 gallons of water. Step 2, take a creative photo with it. Step 3, post your photo online, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., with the hashtag 14 gallons and challenge 3 of your friends to do the same." So, statistics about the 14 Gallons campaign, it's not particularly heartening. There are 246 individual posts, 368 retweets, 746 likes, 159 images were shared, and 197 people were tagged. But to put discussions of risk in terms of the earthquake, a positivist frame for risk would suggest that risk is very much defined by the knowledge we have of the historical geologic record and the material conditions for the populations for whom we define risk. Whether people understand that risk or not is determined by the efficacy of risk communication that functions to help convey relevant facts to them. Opposed to this position is a perspective that risk is culturally, discursively, and rhetorically constructed. This is the position that both Murrell and Grable and Simmons explained in significant work on rhetoric and risk. Grable and Simmons argue that, quote, "risk is socially constructed, and the failure to see risk as socially constructed leads to an artificial separation of risk assessment from risk communication." Now, their perspective is not that risk is a rhetorical fabrication, but that, and this is their quote again, knowledge-making occurs within communication processes, and power is differentially exercised in such processes. They emphasize that, quote, "controversy about risk is reframed not as a problem or a negotiation between the risk maker and the audience, but as a complex web of stakeholders and positions that contribute to the meaning of risk in a given situation." So, in tracking the 14 Gallons lifespan, I selectively employed elements from Greece's iconographic tracking methods. While Greece studied a large distributed data set in her analysis of the Obama Hope image, iconographic tracking can also be used to follow more limited campaigns. Greece outlines her method in Chapter 5 of her book, Still Life with Rhetoric, articulating 4 main steps. So, 1. Deploy digital research to collect a large data set and follow an image to collect a significant amount of data. 2. Assemble that data into a collection using digital archival techniques, software, and folders. 3. Expand and diversify the collection through specific search terms and by exploring social media sites. And then 4. Study specific collectives to determine how an image interacts with humans and non-humans. As part of this final phase of research, Greece argues that scholars should focus on 7 interrelated material processes. And I'll kind of explain these as I talk about what the connections are to the 14 Gallons campaign. So, production is how something was first generated. Oregon Public Broadcasting launched a website, an interactive damage map, a resources page, and a documentary called Unprepared, which was first broadcast through an OPB nature program called Oregon Field Guide. Composition. The rhetorical design of the 14 Gallons hashtag refers to the rhetorical features that were developed in the hashtag itself, part of the protocol. We might argue that the guidelines for the hashtag ask participants to take a photo of themselves with their 14 gallons of water, thus participating in a kind of risk selfie, where the photo is a means of co-identification of themselves and their water as in the state of preparation. Additionally, they're asked to make use of the tag feature of Twitter to directly associate at least 3 other people and thus persuade others to perform the same identification. The hashtag then prompts action, the purchase of water and often water containers, and the hashtag also asks participants to engage in a timely way because presumably if you've been tagged and you care about the issue and the people you're tagged in relation to, you would want to respond. And finally, the hashtag asks for continual reproduction of the hashtag, including the actions to obtain water, the photography, and show evidence for that state of preparation that you're in. Transformation. Following the image to see how it changes. And this is interesting. There is no stable image to begin with, unlike the Obama Hope image. A hashtag with some directions isn't the same thing as a stable image. The protocol asks for a creative photo with your 14 gallons of water, which is kind of hard to determine if you were supposed to be in the image too, and then challenge or tag 3 friends to do the same. And we can watch the images transform over time through repeated use, from OPB's initial images, which mostly including their staff members, pictures of people in water, funny photos, people purchasing water, photos with animals, photos with family and kids, storage questions and storage solutions, information about storage, and then eventually to infographics. So distribution. The initial decisions to disperse the image, which is really just simple. It comes from OPB. Circulation, which is accounting for how something flows. Movement in and out of assemblages. The assemblages shifted from OPB staffers to everyday people and some local celebrities, and then safety organizations. Collectivity. The emergence of different collectives around the images. The initial collective was the OPB staff collective, though these images eventually showed collectives of families in water, and then other safety preparedness related materials, and then finally safety organizations, NGOs, and the public distribution of information in these infographics. And finally, consequentiality. How the thing alters bodies in space and drives contagious rhetorical action. The 14 gallons hashtag certainly altered bodies in space and prompted bodies into action for those that took part in the collection of the 14 gallons of water. Collecting and storing the water was no small act. After all, 14 gallons of water takes up a fair amount of space and weighs 117 pounds, and that's 14 gallons of water per person. The payoff for science and environmental communicators from this analysis occurs when we shift from analysis to possible advice for production. The 7 interrelated material processes from this method can be applied to intentional risk communication campaigns for future use. So, composition prompts for a risk selfie could encourage users to compose a photograph centered around the material objects connected to risk, including materials that could mitigate risk, the location of those materials, and any factors that demonstrate how those materials could be employed if they are needed. Likewise, while users may not need to be prompted to include their pets, friends, and loved ones in an image, risk communication practitioners should leave those elements of composition open for user creativity. Communication practitioners should keep production directions to a minimum in order to facilitate a structure that is both bounded by some guidelines but also open to user ingenuity. If the risk communication campaign is an explicitly visual or novel form, practitioners and instigating agencies can provide example images. In social media campaigns, continued prompting for further posting is key, as are clear directions to use a unique hashtag and tag other followers. Following the transformation of a user-generated campaign can provide a communication specialist with specific insights into the ways that users understand risk. For the 14 gallons campaign, users soon expanded on the literal bounds of the prompt and included more details about the activities surrounding buying, storing, and dealing with 14 gallons of potable water. Users also began including their pets, friends, and family members into the risk selfies and thus the risk preparation efforts they were engaged in, thus reaching more people than the social media account name or tagging practice may have suggested. From this information, we can ascertain that users in this risk context have strong commitments to the affective relationships between preparing for a disaster, the complexities of water storage, and those they wish to protect. Giving the public a chance to show off these commitments is then key. Risk communication distribution details are a little less able to be predetermined, but can allow for vital insights into the effectiveness of a campaign. That said, it comes as no surprise that good risk communication strategies should always plan to gather data about the spread of social media projects. Circulation is important when determining the current phase of social media distribution. So for example, when the 14 gallons hashtag campaign shifted from posts by individual Twitter users to posts representing agencies, many of the posts also shifted in terms of content. The images published by safety organizations were not risk selfies, but representative of a more rational, informational, more positivist communication campaign, including some relatively straightforward infographics. When these images became more dominant, the campaign also began to lose momentum. Risk communication professionals should consider tracking these changes along with the distribution numbers to better understand the publics engaged by the campaign. Considering collectivity points us to the kind of assemblages that gather around practitioner design campaigns. Attending to collectivity gives a name to the practice of determining what effects composition and production have had on a public's generation of images. And analyzing the collectivity of materials that users share helps us identify the assemblages of people and things that are connected with knowledge about risk. Tracking collectivity and then studying that information can attest to the way that non-rational collections are identified and sustained in a campaign. Consequentiality provides evidence for how a risk communication campaign generates additional knowledge, action, or preparation. So for the 14 Gallons campaign, the risk selfies showed that involvement led to additional planning, as the act of gathering and storing water was a prerequisite for participation. Photographic evidence for the success of a risk communication campaign is useful, but so is evidence of the circulation networks built from tagging activities. Though a more abstract concept, consequentiality allows practitioners to describe whether and how participants in a risk communication campaign were persuaded by that campaign. And that concept gives communication professionals language for representing the rational and non-rational forces at work. So ultimately, the lessons that we learned from this campaign kind of come from applying a unique material rhetorical risk analysis to the study of this 14 Gallons hashtag. Ultimately, I think there's some interesting lessons for risk and environmental communication that come out of this, and I appreciate you listening to my presentation. Thanks.